The night Lila drove up the mountain, she told herself the silence was soothing. After months of sleepless city nights and an ugly breakup, her aunt's cabin seemed like salvation. No phones, no neighbors, no reminders of her unraveling life. The road snaked endlessly upward, hemmed by trees that looked skeletal in her headlights. Even with the windows rolled up, she swore she could feel the forest pressing in, a quiet that wasn't peace but something more alert, like the pause before a predator strikes. She glanced at her gas gauge. She was running lower than she'd planned. When the cabin finally emerged from the darkness, it looked smaller than she remembered from childhood summers. The porch light flickered like an old heartbeat, casting long, spidery shadows across the clearing. Lila parked, killed the engine, and stepped out into the crisp mountain air. The smell of pine and damp earth wrapped around her, oddly sharp, almost metallic. She fumbled with the key her aunt had mailed, the forest's hush broken only by the creak of the loose shutter tapping against the siding. She felt suddenly on display, as if something beyond the trees was watching her arrive. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and forgotten winters. The wooden floor groaned under her boots, and the beams overhead seemed to sigh with the wind. She found the light switch, but the bulbs above the kitchen table sputtered and dimmed, throwing more shadow than clarity. Lila set her bag down and exhaled, forcing a laugh at her own unease. The cabin hadn't changed. The crooked bookshelf by the stone fireplace, the chipped enamel kettle on the stove, the old family photos still on the walls. Yet a cold draft slithered across her ankles, and she couldn't tell where it came from. She decided to unpack later and poured herself a glass of water from the tap. As she drank, a faint sound reached her, a slow, deliberate creak from the porch, like the rocking chair had just shifted under weight. She froze, the glass halfway to the counter. Another creak followed, softer but unmistakable. The trees outside stood perfectly still in the window's reflection, no wind to blame. Heart quickening. She told herself it was just the wood settling, or maybe a raccoon. She stepped quietly to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. On the other side, absolute silence. That night, Lila lay in the narrow bed under a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. Sleep hovered just beyond reach as the darkness deepened, thick and heavy. The creaking began again, this time above her, a steady rhythm of footsteps pacing the attic. Her breath caught. The cabin didn't have an attic, at least not one she'd ever seen. She wanted to believe it was an old tree limb rubbing the roof, but the steps were too measured, too purposeful. Then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath. Lila pulled the quilt to her chin, staring at the ceiling, and realized she was utterly, terrifyingly awake. Lila woke before dawn, the uneasy half-sleep leaving her limbs heavy and her mind sluggish. The cabin was unnaturally quiet, as though the forest itself had forgotten to breathe. She wrapped herself in a flannel shirt and stepped onto the creaking floorboards, her bare feet cold against the wood. Every corner of the cabin felt sharper now, edges of furniture, the angles of the beams, as if the house had subtly changed shape overnight. She told herself the footsteps she'd heard had been a dream, but a faint, sourceless draft brushed the back of her neck, making the lie hard to swallow. In the kitchen, she boiled water for coffee, the kettle's whistle breaking the silence like glass shattering. She flinched, spilling some grounds across the counter. The spill felt symbolic somehow, a small rupture in her attempt at calm. While the coffee brewed, her eyes wandered over the familiar photographs on the wall, her aunt smiling in the garden, her own younger self holding a fishing pole by the lake. But as her gaze swept across them, a chill ran through her. One of the frames, a group photo she didn't recall, showed a figure lurking at the treeline, almost transparent, as if half erased from memory. Determined not to spiral, Lila decided to explore the cabin's small hallway. She counted the doors: bathroom, linen closet, bedroom, and then stopped. At the very end, where she was certain there had always been a blank wall, a narrow wooden door stood slightly ajar. The paint was fresh compared to the rest of the cabin, its handle cold to the touch. Her aunt had never mentioned renovations. The air around the door seemed denser, like humidity before a storm. For a moment, she considered calling her aunt, but the idea of explaining her unease felt childish and desperate. She pushed the door open, revealing a cramped stairwell spiraling upward into darkness. A faint smell of old paper and cedar drifted down, mixed with something earthier, like soil or mildew. Her heart thudded as she climbed, each step groaning under her weight. At the top was a small, dust-choked attic room, the air stale and heavy. The single circular window was clouded over with grime, and beneath it sat a low wooden chest. She knelt, brushing dust from the lid, and hesitated. The cabin wasn't supposed to have an attic, yet here it was, and this chest felt like something deliberately hidden. The lid creaked open reluctantly, revealing a pile of yellowed papers tied with twine. She lifted one bundle free and untied it, unfolding brittle letters written in an unfamiliar hand. The words blurred at first in the dim light, but a phrase leapt out at her. "The whispers will keep you if you listen too long." Beneath the letters lay an old photograph of the cabin, decades older, with the same rocking chair on the porch, and in the background, at the attic window, a faint figure watching. A wave of dread settled over her as she realized the rocking chair outside was swaying again, though the air was still perfectly calm. Lila sat cross-legged on the attic floor, the brittle letters spread out like fallen leaves. The first bundle told of a man named Elias Birch, a woodsman who had once owned the cabin. His words began plainly enough, accounts of harsh winters and solitude, but gradually unraveled into paranoia. He wrote of whispers in the walls, of nights when the forest leaned closer and voices coaxed him toward the trees. In one letter, his handwriting devolved into frantic scrawls. "The trees move when you're not looking. They watch. They wait." A shiver crawled up Lila's spine. She flipped through more letters, each darker than the last. Elias described seeing shadowy figures in the clearing at night, their faces indistinct, their movements wrong, too fluid, too silent. He claimed the rocking chair would sway on windless nights, and sometimes he woke to find it facing the forest instead of the porch. In a final, smeared note, he confessed, "I've begun to hear my own name in the whispers. If I answer, I will not return." The lantern's flames sputtered then, as though reacting to the words that a sudden creak from downstairs snapped her attention to the present. The sound was unmistakable, the front door easing open. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She blew out the lantern and strained her ears. The cabin below seemed to shift, boards groaning, air thickening, as if someone had stepped inside. She tiptoed to the attic's edge, peering down the stairwell, but saw only darkness swallowing the narrow hallway. Then, faint but clear, a whisper floated up, soft, almost curious. "Lila," her name, spoken in a voice she couldn't place, sent a bolt of cold through her chest. She clutched one of the letters like a talisman and crept down the stairs. The hallway was darker than before, the photographs on the walls seeming slightly askew. The front door was closed, bolted exactly as she'd left it. But the rocking chair's motion was different now. No gentle sway, but a deliberate back and forth, creaking louder with each swing. Lila's pulse thundered in her ears as she reached for the doorframe, debating whether to flee outside or stay put. The whispers came again, now a murmur of overlapping voices threading through the walls, too many voices, weaving her name into their cadence. She backed into the kitchen, fumbling for her phone, only to remember there was no signal this high in the mountains. Then, as suddenly as they began, the whispers stopped. The rocking chair stilled. The forest outside seemed to retreat, its presence no longer pressing so tightly against the cabin. But Lila knew this was only a pause, not an ending. She glanced at the letters in her hand, and a terrible certainty settled in. Whatever Elias Birch had faced here was stirring again. By first light, Lila had stuffed her duffel bag with only what she could grab: letters, phone, keys, and the flannel she'd slept in. The rocking chair had remained still all night, but the silence felt performative, as if the forest were waiting for her next move. She kept her eyes down while locking the cabin door, refusing to glance at the attic window. Her boots sank into damp earth as she crossed to the car, breath fogging in the cold morning air. The forest was hushed, too hushed, as though every bird and insect had fled. The car engine roared to life with a reluctant growl, and relief swept over her. Gravel crunched beneath her tires as she steered onto the narrow mountain road. But barely 10 minutes downhill, the fog thickened unnaturally, swallowing the world beyond her headlights. Branches loomed closer to the roadside, their silhouettes bent in strange angles, as if the trees had leaned in overnight. Her GPS lost signal, and her phone's battery drained inexplicably fast, flickering from 40% to nearly dead in moments. A prickle of panic tightened in her chest. She slowed the car to a crawl, scanning for familiar landmarks. But the road seemed unfamiliar now, longer, narrower, curving in ways it shouldn't. A fleeting movement at the edge of her vision made her jerk the wheel, something dark and spindly darting between trees, keeping pace with her car. Her heart hammered as she gripped the wheel tighter. The radio, which she hadn't turned on, crackled to life on its own, a distorted whisper threading through the static. Her name surfaced again, Lila, drawn out, slow, like a breath on the back of her neck. She pressed the accelerator, the car fishtailing slightly on damp gravel. The fog thinned momentarily, and she thought she glimpsed a road sign, until she realized it was the cabin itself, impossibly ahead of her. Its crooked frame and flickering porch light sat at the bend in the road like a patient predator. Her stomach lurched. She slammed on the brakes, tires skidding, and stared. She had been driving straight downhill for nearly an hour, yet here was the same clearing she had left. The rocking chair moved slowly, deliberately, as if mocking her attempt to leave. That Lila's breath came in shallow gasps. She turned the car around, determined to try another direction, but every path seemed to loop her back to the cabin. With each pass, the forest felt closer, the branches drooping lower, the mist coiling thicker, the whispers a little louder. Finally, trembling and exhausted, she pulled back into the clearing. The porch light flickered once and went steady, almost welcoming. The rocking chair stopped mid-sway as though satisfied. Lila killed the engine, hands shaking on the wheel, and understood with growing dread. The forest wasn't going to let her go so easily. The forest's silence returned with a weight that pressed against the cabin walls. Lila locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and lit the lantern she'd brought down from the attic. It flickered weakly, revealing a swirl of dust motes suspended in the stale air. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. She kept telling herself she just needed to wait for daylight. Surely morning would bring a clear road out. But in her chest, she felt the forest's unseen gaze, patient and unyielding. She spread the letters across the kitchen table, desperate for answers. Some of Elias Birch's final entries hinted that he, too, had tried to leave and failed. One line stood out: "When the voices move inside, it's already too late." A chill crawled up her spine as she read it aloud under her breath. The air around her seemed to stir at the sound, as though the cabin itself had heard. The lantern's flame bent sideways, though no draft touched her skin. That a faint rustling noise came from the living room. It wasn't the porch this time, it was inside. Lila held her breath, straining to listen. The sound grew louder. Papers shifting, wood creaking beneath unseen weight. Then a whisper threaded through the noise, clearer than ever before. "Lila." It wasn't one voice now, but many, overlapping, their tones weaving together like an unholy chorus. The sound came from the direction of the attic stairs. Lila stood, her legs trembling, and gripped the lantern. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking despite her attempt at steadiness. The whispers ceased instantly, leaving an even heavier silence in their wake. She forced herself toward the attic stairs, each step of the hallway groaning beneath her. The air felt dense, syrupy, like wading through something unseen. When she reached the base of the attic steps, she froze. A shape was there, just beyond the lantern's edge, a faint, human-like outline. Too tall, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. Before she could react, the lantern sputtered and nearly died, plunging the room into near darkness. The silhouette didn't move closer. It only tilted its head farther, as if studying her. Then the whispers returned, surrounding her from every corner of the cabin, overlapping, urgent, and beckoning. Lila stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, her heartbeat deafening in her ears. The lantern steadied just enough for her to see the outline melt into the shadows of the attic steps. The rocking chair outside began to sway again, slow and deliberate, even though the air was utterly still. Lila knew then, whatever haunted this place wasn't content to stay outside anymore. Lila's fear had hardened into a trembling resolve. She couldn't spend another night being toyed with by whispers and shadows. If Elias Birch had confronted whatever haunted this place, maybe he'd left some clue among his letters. She reread his fragmented words under the lantern light. They want you to answer. They feed on the fear. Her throat tightened. Maybe silence wasn't enough. Maybe she had to face them on her terms. She slipped on her boots and grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace, its weight both grounding and absurdly inadequate. She spoke aloud to the cabin, her voice steadier than she expected. I know you're here. I'm not running anymore. The air seemed to shift, as though the room had drawn a long, quiet breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a single letter fluttered off the table and landed at her feet. Its edges were singed, as if burned long ago. Lila crouched and picked it up. Scrawled across the paper in frantic, jagged script was a line she hadn't seen before. The truth is in the roots. Dig, and you'll find where the whispers began. The words sent a pulse of dread through her. The cabin's foundation rested on old, tangled tree roots. She remembered her aunt mentioning it once, a quirk of its construction. The forest had been here far longer than the cabin, its roots winding deep into the mountain's heart. Lila felt certain that whatever this presence was, it was older still. She glanced toward the window. The branches outside seemed to press even closer, as if they, too, were listening. The rocking chair on the porch tilted forward, its front legs lifting off the boards, before slowly settling back down with a groan. She stepped outside into the misty clearing, the night air sharp in her lungs. The forest surrounded her like a living wall. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once and then went silent. Lila circled to the cabin's rear where the ground sloped downward, exposing a crawl space tangled with roots. She crouched, the earth cold and damp beneath her hands, and began scraping at the soil with the poker. The ground resisted, heavy and compacted, but she kept digging. A faint vibration pulsed through the earth, subtle at first, then stronger, as if something deep below stirred in response. After several minutes, her poker struck something hollow, wood, splintered and rotting. She clawed away more soil until the outline of a buried wooden box emerged. Its surface was scarred, its lid bound with rusted metal hinges. As she reached for it, the forest seemed to lean in, branches rustling without wind, shadows gathering. A whisper, low, urgent, almost pleading, brushed her ear, "Don't." But Lila's curiosity overpowered her fear. She pried open the lid. Inside, barely visible in the lantern's weak light, was an old key, a bundle of hair tied with faded ribbon, and a note smeared with something dark. The whispers rose in a sudden chorus, almost angry, as if she'd just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Lila's hands shook as she lifted the smeared note from the box. The paper felt damp and brittle, its edges frayed. Under the dirt and smears, she could just make out Elias Birch's handwriting. The words, though faded, were chillingly clear. The key is not for the cabin. It is for what the forest buried. If you free it, you cannot bind it again. Burn this place before it wakes. Her breath caught. The whispers, soft and overlapping, began to thread through the trees again, circling her like wolves in the fog. The bundle of hair felt impossibly old, dry, brittle strands tied with a faded blue ribbon. It was small, the lock of a child or someone delicate. Lila dropped it back into the box as if it burned her fingers. She glanced at the key, its surface pitted and darkened with age. A terrible thought gnawed at her. Somewhere nearby, something was locked away, and the forest wanted her to open it. The rocking chair groaned from the porch behind her, its movement sharp and deliberate, as though urging her back inside. She stood, clutching the lantern and the box, and backed toward the cabin. The mist thickened, and the trees seemed closer than they'd been seconds before. A shape flickered at the edge of her vision, tall, too thin, gliding silently between the trunks. Lila's pulse thundered. The whispers grew louder, their words clearer now. Turn the key. Set us free. The chorus of voices swelled, some pleading, some angry, all pressing against her mind. Inside the cabin, the temperature had dropped sharply, her breath visible in the dim light. The attic door hung wide open, a black maw at the top of the stairs. As she set the box on the kitchen table, a sudden bang shook the walls. Something heavy had fallen upstairs. The lantern flickered violently, and for a heartbeat, the photographs on the wall all seemed to shift, the figures inside them subtly turning their heads toward her. She grabbed the poker again, her hands slick with sweat. The whispers stopped as abruptly as they'd begun, replaced by a new sound, slow, deliberate footsteps on the attic stairs, descending one by one. Each step groaned under a weight she couldn't see. Lila raised the poker, heart hammering, and backed toward the door. The final step creaked, and then silence. The lantern's flame steadied, casting its glow toward the hallway. It was empty, yet she felt it. The presence, standing just out of sight, waiting. The key on the table glinted faintly, a silent invitation that seemed more like a threat. Lila stared at the key, her breath shallow, each inhale shaky. The forest outside no longer felt distant. It felt inside, crowding the cabin with its damp, woody scent. The whispers had fallen silent, but that silence was worse than their chorus. It wasn't relief, it was expectation. She thought of Elias Birch's warning, "Burn this place before it wakes." Her fingers hovered over the key. Somewhere beyond the walls, something ancient and patient seemed to lean closer, waiting for her choice. She weighed her options. She could flee again, but she knew the road would only bring her back. She could burn the cabin, but the forest was wet with fog and rain, and she doubted a single lantern flame could overcome the soaked timber. The key gleamed under the lantern's trembling light, impossibly heavy with possibility. She imagined what might be locked beneath the roots, something the earth itself had tried to keep hidden. Her pulse pounded as a thought rooted itself. Maybe unlocking it was the only way to end this. The first creak came from the porch, the rocking chair moving on its own again. Then another creak, closer, inside the living room. Lila's eyes flicked toward the sound, but nothing moved in the lantern's glow. The silence thickened, like a held breath. Then, faintly, a single voice, unlike the overlapping whispers, spoke, low and deliberate. "You have the key, Lila. You know what to do." It wasn't a demand. It sounded almost mournful, like a plea from someone already lost. Her resolve wavered. The poker felt useless in her hand now, a childish weapon against something that didn't play by the rules of her world. She stepped toward the box, her boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. Her hand closed around the key, its metal unervingly warm, as if it had been held moments ago by someone unseen. Outside the window, the trees seemed to shudder in anticipation. The air in the cabin thickened, the lantern dimming slightly. Lila felt the forest leaning in. She whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible. "If this is the only way, then show me." The whispers swelled again, distant but eager, threading through the walls and the floorboards, a storm of voices both urging and warning. The lantern flared once, throwing her shadow long and distorted across the walls. Lila stepped outside into the fog-drenched clearing, the key clutched tight in her fist. The forest opened around her like a great, waiting mouth. Somewhere beyond the tree-line, she heard something, massive and slow, begin to stir. The forest guided her, or trapped her, into a clearing she hadn't seen before. The oak at its center towered over the others, its trunk twisted like a spine. Its massive roots pushed up through the soil in grotesque patterns, and nestled between them was a small, rusted door, barely 3 feet tall, its hinges swallowed by moss. The whispers had grown softer but more insistent, their voices threading through the fog like 1,000 distant sighs. Lila's lantern flickered, as though the air itself had grown wary. Paragraph 2. She knelt in the damp earth, brushing dirt and roots from the door's surface. The metal was icy beneath her fingers, as though untouched by time. The key slid perfectly into the lock, almost too easily. Her hand hovered, unsure. Elias Birch's warning thundered in her memory. "If you free it, you cannot bind it again." But the forest's silence was unbearable now, a pressure that felt like it would crush her if she didn't act. Her breath trembled in the mist as she turned the key. Paragraph 3. The lock gave way with a low, echoing click, and the ground beneath her seemed to sigh. Relief or warning, she couldn't tell. The door swung inward to reveal a narrow stone passage descending into darkness, colder and damper than the forest air. A scent like wet earth mixed with something older, iron, decay, and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. As Lila stepped closer, her lantern light was swallowed quickly, as though the darkness was alive, consuming every flicker of brightness. She stepped inside, poker in one hand, lantern in the other. The walls were slick with moisture, carved with faint symbols she didn't recognize. The whispers returned in a low, rhythmic chant, their words indistinct but their intent unmistakable. They wanted her deeper. The corridor sloped downward sharply, the air growing heavier, almost liquid. At one point, she thought she heard footsteps behind her, soft, deliberate. But when she turned, only the oak's roots framed the entrance, now impossibly far away. The passage ended in a small, circular chamber. At its center stood a stone pedestal, and atop it rested a bundle of withered roots cradling a small wooden mask, its features distorted, its eye holes deep and endless. The whispers became deafening, circling her like a cyclone. The ground trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. Lila understood in that instant. This wasn't something she could free or destroy. It was something that had been waiting for her, patiently, for decades, or maybe centuries. As the mask's hollow eyes seemed to turn toward her, a shadow, immense, formless, and older than the forest, unfurled from the darkness behind it. The chamber's air pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, as if the forest itself had a heartbeat. Lila clutched the poker until her knuckles ached, the lantern shaking in her other hand. The shadow behind the mask unfurled further, its tendrils curling along the walls like vines. The whispers were no longer many voices. They had become one, vast and resonant, vibrating through her bones. You opened the door. You cannot unmake what is awake. Lila's throat was dry, her breath shallow. The mask's hollow eyes flared brighter, and for a heartbeat she saw images in their glow. Elias Birch standing in this same chamber, terrified, the cabin being built over the buried door. Generations of watchers who had failed to keep the forest's secret contained. Lila understood now. The forest wasn't haunted. It was the haunting, a living memory too old for human reckoning. She realized her choice wasn't about saving herself. It was about whether to let it spread beyond these mountains. She backed toward the passageway, the lantern casting wild shadows. The presence followed, slow but inevitable, the ground trembling beneath its weightless form. She thought of Elias's last warning: burn this place before it wakes. If the forest was the prison, then the cabin, the key, the letters, were its bindings. Lila dropped the poker, grabbed the lantern with both hands, and hurled it onto the pedestal. Glass shattered, flames licking the dry, ancient roots. The mask screamed, not in sound, but in a pressure that split her skull. Before the fire engulfed it, the chamber quaked violently, dust and stones raining from the ceiling. Lila sprinted up the corridor, the walls warping around her as if trying to close her in. Behind her, a roar, not like any animal, but like the forest itself being torn, echoed up the passage. She burst through the iron door just as the oak's roots began to writhe, the clearing collapsing inward. The cabin's porch light flickered madly. The rocking chair toppled from the porch, its final groan swallowed by the sound of the forest convulsing in rage and pain. By dawn, the cabin was gone, swallowed by a sinkhole of twisted roots and smoking earth. Lila stood at the mountain's edge, her car miraculously parked on a solid road, the forest now distant and silent, as if it had never shifted against her. The letters and the box were gone, but the old key lay in her pocket, still warm. In the valley below, the trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, looking harmless again. Yet as Lila turned away, a faint whisper curled on the wind, soft, almost loving. "We'll wait." She shivered, knowing the forest's patience was infinite, and that she had merely delayed its awakening.